Hey everyone, welcome to the Lust is Boring podcast. Got a question for you. Is virginity the greatest gift I can give in a marriage? The answer, no, you are. This line caught my attention from a blog written by today's guest, Rachael Gieger, and I thought, I got to get this woman on the show. Listen to what she says in this blog. So she says, as again, is virginity the greatest gift I can give in a marriage? No, you are. She said, so the most beautiful gift you can give your husband, it's you. The broken, messy, unrepeatable, redeemed, incredible you. She goes on and adds that this overemphasis on virginity ends up idolizing a quality that is only meant to be a physical representation of an ontological reality, not the standard for chastity. And so I thought, I got to get Rachael on this show, and we got to chat. So, Rachael, welcome to the Lust is Boring podcast. Thanks so much for coming on.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Now, what I'm curious, what got you passionate about writing this and wanting to minister to women who've kind of been through this, experience of feeling like, oh, great, it's gone. I'm worthless or I'm worth less. What's gotten you passionate about wanting to reach out, not only to women, but, men as well, with this topic?
Yeah. So I've been speaking about just sexual sin in general for a few years now and ministering to women more on the porn addiction side. But that just kind of led to a lot of conversations with these women and with some of my friends just about loss of virginity in regards to sexual sin and what that does to them. And I've just been kind of toying with what virginity actually is, just kind of being with them and their pain and as they work through that in their story. So I actually worked on this article for several months and did several drafts, and it just didn't feel right. And then finally the right draft came, and there it was.
No, we appreciate for you stepping into this because there's so much backlash against the purity culture going on right now. And for those viewers who might be watching now on YouTube Live or listening on the podcast, well, what's this purity culture? I mean, at first it strikes you as an odd concept because our culture, a purity culture, I mean, look at the Grammys, look at the Super Bowl. I mean, like, this is not a purity culture in which we're being marinated in. But nonetheless, some people have said, hey, there's a real issue with what we grew up in our churches and our youth groups, and there's a bit of a backlash. Maybe give our listeners an idea of what is this purity culture that a lot of people are kind of getting upset about.
I think purity culture, well, I think we have to separate it from kind of like the militant purity culture that maybe some of our Protestant brothers and sisters encountered. But the Catholic purity culture, I think, looks a little bit different. But I think what kind of comes under that umbrella is just chastity that feels kind of pressured, or that purity is like the height of virtue, that physical purity is the height of virtue, which includes like loss of virginity as like the capital sin, and just kind of that overemphasis on purity, especially physical purity, when it comes to dating or relationships, and just kind of that fear-based culture when it comes to purity.
Yeah, I know you'll agree with me that, we should add as a disclaimer as we dive into this subject that we're not saying that virginity is not a big deal. It's like,
yes.
Purity, sexual sin, not a big problem. Like, we're Definitely not saying that at all. I remember one girl tell me that, like, her boyfriend kept pressuring her to sleep with him and give him her virginity, and he kept telling, it's not a big deal. And I said, look, just tell the guy, if it's not a big deal, then why are you so interested in getting it?
Yes.
And that'll probably quiet that guy up pretty fast. And we're also not saying that if you lost your virginity, don't fret, not a big deal. Hey, life goes on. Like, okay, you're allowed to feel mourning or loss or whatever. If you're feeling that, you're allowed to feel what you feel, because, virginity is a great gift. It is. I mean, the church honors the saints, the virgins, the confessors, the martyrs, the virgins. The church honors the perpetual virginity of Mary. So, I thought it'd be important that before we really dive in, we explain that we're not saying that virginity is not a good, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the biggest hinge point there is, and what we're probably going to talk about more, is virginity is a gift because you are. And I think too often purity culture, or what we want to call purity culture, flips it, where it's like you are a gift because you have your virginity, right? So we're more putting this, we're saying virginity is a gift because you are a person, and this is a gift because of you, rather than kind of the narrative that has been sold a little too often.
No, I've never heard it put that way, but that's gold. I mean, that is really good stuff. And I think as we dive in, to the big, what I would consider like the big 7 problems with idolizing virginity, I think first we need to set a bit of a historical context that I want to dive into of like, well, why, why this big push for abstinence and virginity, especially in the 1990s and the 2000s. And we got to set the historical context that, after the sexual revolution started in the 60s, in the 70s and 80s, we saw an unprecedented rise in sexual activity among young people, especially high school kids. Starting in the early 1990s, we were at a point where the majority of high school students were currently sexually active. So it was 54% of American high school kids were sexually active in the early 1990s. And so with this early sexual activity came skyrocketing STDs. We had unwanted pregnancies. We had millions of people dying of AIDS. You had peer pressure. So essentially a great devaluation, so to speak, of purity. People saying, look, it's not a big deal. My wife, Crystal, would share in her testimony that, when she was thinking of losing her virginity at the age of 15, the friends like, look, it's not a big deal. As long as you feel ready, just get it over with. Everybody's doing it. I mean, just get it over with. Like you're talking about like removing your wisdom teeth or something. But, and so just this devaluation of like, it's not a big deal. But then I'd meet the girls afterwards. I remember meeting a girl in Chicago in a real poor area after her high school talk. And she and I were sitting alone talking. And she kind of held out her hands to me and she said, Jason, last night my hands were filled with pools of my own blood from cutting myself after I hooked up with that guy again. I came home with so much self-hatred and guilt. And some people would look at that. See, that's purity culture. They overemphasized her physical value. And so she felt this shame. But it's like, wait a minute, time out. Like she was used by another person. The solution to that is not to numb her conscience and say, I'm sexually liberated. Who cares if he even texts me afterwards? It's like, no, let her feel this, because there was almost such a targeting of women's innocence in the wrong way. I remember one girl told me she overheard a couple boys in her high school saying this quote. She said, we already got all the seniors and juniors. Let's go de-virginize the freshmen and sophomores. And so this is the culture of what was going on. And so, a lot of people in government are like, oh, give these kids condoms. That's what they need. They just need more safe sex. But that message of safe sex to me, I've always said, is so degrading to women because to be blunt, it reduces a woman to her genitals. Because look, you didn't get pregnant. You don't have gonorrhea. You're safe. Oh, really? Yeah. I'm protected? Not quite. And so because of all that was going on, I think the pendulum kind of swung back in the other direction. So by the late 1990s, the government was doing what's called Title V abstinence education. This is federal funding to the tune of about $50 million a year of abstinence education. Now, that pales in comparison to what was being dished out for safe sex education. But finally, abstinence was getting some money. So you saw purity balls, purity rings, this focus on abstinence more than chastity, virginity rocks t-shirts, modest is hottest t-shirts. And now the generation who went through that is expressing some indigestion, so to speak, of like the message of abstinence, modest is hottest, it didn't quite hit the mark. So would you say that paints a fairly fair picture of, where the pendulum has swung? And now that we've gone all the way over here, people are wanting to find some middle ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think pendulum was the word that came to mind for me too. Because Satan always tempts us to extremes, right? It's always going to either be like virginity is nothing or virginity is everything. And where we need to go is virginity is something. It's something sacred and good, but it does need to be that middle line. And yeah, I totally agree. I think pendulum is the perfect word. We've maybe swung a little too far, and it's time to just bring the dial back to a place where people aren't afraid and they don't feel like dirt or damaged goods, but also they treat their virginity with the respect and the sacredness that should be treated with,
Yeah, I think that offers a perfect segue into our kind of the 7 big problems that I would say of idolizing virginity. And so those of you who watch it on YouTube, feel free to leave comments, share, discuss this. But 7 big problems. Starting at number 1, if we idolize virginity, a lot of times what happens is it leaves people feeling like, as you said, like damaged goods if they're not. Sometimes we had abstinence presentations in the 90s that were like, girls, you see this rose? That's you. That's your virginity. But then you get with one boy, pluck. Another guy, pluck, and they start plucking off all the rose petals, and then you've got this barren stem. Like, is that what you want to be on your wedding night? And for these like 13-year-old girls, it's like, oh, no, I don't. I want to be that full blooming rose. But then
Yeah.
you've got that 13-year-old and the girl in the corner is like, I am not a virgin, or I was, raped, when I was 12. And it's
Yeah.
like, that's me. I'm that barren. And then someone else comes in. It's like a piece of gum. You've got this fresh piece of gum and then blah, 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 chew it. Who wants this chewed piece of gum? And so it just makes you feel like you have less to offer. And it's, like I said, especially hurtful to those who've been sexually abused. But, just for those who lost their virginity, it's like, okay, great. You're really motivating these girls, but you're making me feel like absolute damaged goods.
Yeah, and I think it does injustice to our doctrine of redemption, right? Like either we have a savior who redeems all, including our body, or we don't. And again, like kind of like St. Paul says, that's not an excuse to go and sin whenever we want. Like, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. That doesn't mean we can just sin. But it does mean that either the experience of redemption is real, even in our sexuality, or it isn't. And we want to bank on the fact that it is. And I think especially for people who are victims of abuse or rape or other terrible crimes against them, I can't even imagine like the psychological and emotional hurt that they carry if they feel like their own church or their own community isn't supporting them in that and isn't telling them to look forward in hope to a holy and happy relationship in marriage, or possibly a vocation to the religious life, wherever they're going to find their vocation, that they can look forward and hope to that and not feel like they're walking in already damaged because of something they didn't willingly do. And then if they didn't, or if it was an act of their own will, women especially, I think for me, this was my biggest motivation in writing this article was I just want my friends to believe that Jesus has done it all, like has redeemed them, and that none of us walk in with perfect virtue and with perfect chastity to marriage, especially, but just that they can walk in to their marriages trusting, if they have fallen and recommitted to virtue, that Jesus is with them and he loves them, and that their gift of self can't be taken away.
Yeah, and I tend to often speak directly into this because my wife shares often how she was sexually abused when she was younger by a family member, had some really horribly abusive dating relationships. And, I try to explain to girls, like, I don't love her less because that stuff happened to her. If anything, you kind of want to love her more to make up for what these jerks did, so it's not like, oh, that's you. Like pinning our very identity on something someone else did to us. That gives them way too much power. It's like absolutely. You already felt overpowered at that time when they were violating, but now to let that power go into your future of like, now I become defined by how you polluted me. It's like, no, at some point you cut them off and said like, my future will not be dictated. My worthiness of love will not be determined because something happened to me in the past. I'm not some barren little rose stem. I'm not some chewed up piece of gum. I'm a beloved daughter of God, and in that lies my worthiness in being loved. Not what I've done. It's not like I'm more worthy of being loved because I'm a virgin. Like I have held on to it to my mind. I'm so worthy of love this night. It's like, no, like ingesting some of this stuff, you can understand the educators at the time, I'm sure had the best of intentions, right? Because they're looking out to this crowd of, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed little, teenagers and like, hey, I really want to get these kids to save their virginity. But when you've got, what is it, like something like 80% of evangelical Christians, at least not waiting to the wedding night, well, we've got to not forget them, and think that something just happens after college. No, it's happening in the grade schools too, and we got to make sure we're tailoring our message to be sensitive.
Yeah, and you want people to preserve their virginity out of love and not out of fear, right? And so what those tactics do is they it's this preemptive fear and shame when you want to build, especially the youth, up to preserve this gift out of love, and out of love primarily for how God has created them, and out of love for God, but love for each other. And then if for some reason that gift has been given away, whether out of their own volition or not, they can still rest on that love of God, how they've been created, and that they're made for that love, right?
Yeah. Yeah, if you think about it, love is the only motivating force that would even enable you to save yourself for marriage, even if you've made mistakes in the past. Because like, for me, I did get married at the age of 26, 27, whatever it was, as a virgin. But like, what motivated me to do that? It wasn't like, oh no, I'm going to get gonorrhea otherwise. It's like, oh no, unwed pregnancy rates. Like that wasn't even on the radar. Some people say, oh, well, saving sex for marriage would be the hardest thing. It really wasn't. It's difficult, but it's like, who am I surrounding myself with? When I'm with the wrong type of people, it'd be difficult. If I'm dating the wrong type of people, I'm just making it harder on myself than it needs to be. But find somebody who shares your values and surround yourself with good guys, It's totally doable. We just make it
Yes.
harder than it needs to be. But second big problem, I think, from idolizing virginity is it contributes to the myth that virginity equals purity. And so as long as I'm technically a virgin, I'm good. So looking at porn, doing this, doing that. Oh, well, yeah, we went right up to the line, but we didn't cross it. So I've still got my V card, so we're good. So maybe speak to that, how it contributes to that myth that purity is virginity. And as long as you got that intact, you're pretty much good.
Yeah, that kind of makes me laugh because I don't know, it's two sides of the coin. If we collapse the virtue of chastity, to just the physical quality of virginity, the sin follows right along with it, right? We collapse sin to only the losing of virginity. And that's no good for anybody. I don't, I encountered that a lot, just in discussions with my peers throughout high school and college, of just kind of the definition of what is losing your virginity, and kind of culturally that's still disagreed upon. But if it's everything but the physical losing of it, then we're good. And I think, again, like that comes with not recognizing the damage that sexual sin does to your heart, right? And if we root ourselves in the love of God and how he created us and our gift of self, our focus should primarily be on our soul and not on our body. And then as a result of focusing on our soul, our body comes right along with it, and we can protect that too. But I think the virginity equals purity. It just doesn't do anybody any good on both sides of the coin.
Yeah. And to me, it's the difference between the words abstinence and chastity. I mean, people get the words confused. We're like, well, what's celibacy? What's abstinence, chastity? Aren't they pretty much the same thing? Well, celibacy is the state of not being married. That's the definition of celibacy. Abstinence is the absence of sex. And so if you told me, Bob is abstinent, it's like, great. I mean, that doesn't really tell you much about Bob. I mean, Bob could be a virtuous man. Bob could be unable to find a date. Bob could have died 300 years ago. Like, we really have no idea. It's just the absence of something, whereas chastity is the presence of that virtue of chastity that, has to do with integrates our speech, the way we dress, the way we dance, physical affection, the modesty of our intentions, the whole human person. And I think because oftentimes in evangelical circles, they lacked a deeper theology of sexuality, of what is the purpose and meaning of human sexuality? How is it the wedding vows made flesh and the procreation and union? It was lacking a historical theology of sex. And as a result, what they had was abstinence. And, this is the goal. We got to keep abstinence. And yes, you should strive for purity, but what that means is debatable. Like, is masturbation okay? Well, what about this? What about that? I mean, you even had, very big, well-known Christian leaders who couldn't come down clear on topics like masturbation or contraceptions because they lacked that theology of sex. And what they were left with was the message of just general abstinence. And as well, what's the focus of abstinence? Virginity. And so we've got to get back to the theological underpinnings of the beauty of God's plan for human sexuality to see the big picture.
Yeah, and that was another goal in the article, and some of the feedback that I got was really interesting because people took. You read one of the quotes at the beginning about how I said something about the greatest gift you can give in a marriage is you, and some people took that at face value and were really upset. They're like, "Are you bashing virginity? Are you saying it doesn't matter?" And I was like, "Well, read the whole article." What I'm trying to point out is that our theology of sexuality as Catholics is so robust. It is so full. Like John Paul II's theology of the body is just such an amazing anthropological work. It's not just about sex, right? And I think that's the goal now, to move away from purity culture, is take people deeper, not change the narrative. And I think it's helping people see like the truth hasn't changed. Like what is sin is still sin, right? We don't have to become more liberal in our understanding of sin, but rather what a certain generation goes through or continues to go through is different than the past. And so we have to change the way the truth is articulated. But we're always called to take people deeper into the understanding of that truth.
Yeah, no, good points. And I need to add too, as I mentioned those things regarding evangelical Christianity, I don't want to come across as, hey, Protestants got it wrong, us Catholics got it right. So you just, no, I mean, we've got a lot to learn from them in terms of their evangelical zeal and how much they were on the front lines battling this promiscuity culture in the 90s. It's almost as, Catholics tend to invest so much in the pro-life movement, whereas I think evangelicals are really moving into the front of abstinence. But there's so much more I think we can do together. And I think even them, they're starting to adopt more of the language of chastity now, because books are being written against purity culture. People who grew up in that, rebelling against it, rejecting it. And so if our third point was this idea that as long as I'm a virgin, I'm pure, I think the third point is kind of the inversion of that, where it contributes to the myth that the absence of virginity equals the absence of purity. In other words, look, once it's gone, and it's over. And I've already lost my virginity. What's the point of waiting for marriage now? Once that's gone, if I've slept with one guy, is 2 that much of a difference, or 3? It doesn't matter. The virginity is gone. And so to me, it leads to that despair of thinking that if you're not a virgin, you can't be pure.
Yeah, and I encounter this a lot, just working with women who are addicted to porn and masturbation, and I encountered that in my own struggle against addiction. But that's exactly how the enemy keeps you trapped. Is like, you've gone there, you don't deserve anything better, so just keep going there. That's all you're ever going to get. And I had a friend in particular who really struggled with that kind of hookup culture in her own life. And that was something she actually said to me, like through like a lot of tears, is she was like, I can't do anything different. I'm not worth anything more than this. Like, how do I do anything different? And so that's the question of a lot of women and men who have lost their virginity, is how am I supposed to do anything different now? But I think also that doesn't do justice to redemption or conversion. I've known women who and men who lose their virginity and come back from it so convicted about the beauty of their sexuality and how to save sex for marriage that they have some of the most thriving, wonderful relationships while they're dating and in marriage because of that renewed conviction. Kind of, on the opposite end, you have people who think, kind of what we talked about before, but that virginity equals purity. And so they sexually struggle with porn or masturbation or many other things, but they have their virginity, so it's fine, but they encounter the lack of healthy sexuality in their own life. So I think to say once it's lost, it's gone, like that doesn't do justice to redemption and conversion and what a renewed fire of conviction can do for your life.
Good points. Moving on to number 4 here, and this is a big one. Idolizing virginity, I would say, puts and kind of extra emphasis and even blame on the woman rather than the man. The focus is on the woman. Yeah. Now, why is this? I think there's partly an illegitimate reason to why this happened, an unhealthy, but then there's also a healthy. And I would say the legitimate reason, I think, where more emphasis is put on the women is because it's kind of, in my opinion, sex, it's undeniable, is sexist. In the sense that the woman always bears the greater burden of the result of sexual intimacy. She stands to lose much more from an unwise sexual investment in a potential mate. And so historically, they've had to be more choosy because a guy can move on and be gone, where this could be quite an investment in terms of gestation, lactation, rearing a child, where he could just end up being a deadbeat dad. And so historically, the church has taught that here's the way it should work. Love, marriage, sex, babies. That's the order. And then when historically we're like, well, let's take the sex part and put it before the marriage and let's put love over here and marriage, that's when things start to go awry. And so sociologically, so many studies have been done on when young women become sexually active. There's a research that you can pull up that it shows that if a woman becomes sexually active as a young teen, she's more likely to have more breakups, STDs, out of wedlock pregnancy, become a single mom, live under the poverty level, be depressed, attempt suicide, have a divorce. I mean, the numbers go on and on and on. And you don't see this as drastically in the male numbers. I mean, there's no such thing as like homes for unwed dads. I mean, it doesn't exist. Yeah. I mean, it's like, oh, you're an unwed dad, go get a job at Chick-fil-A. All right. They got applications waiting for you. You're going to be just fine. And so because of the disproportional fallout of the sexual revolution on the well-being of women, I think in a sense that they were proportionally targeted as the message of chastity. Good intentioned, but it ended up creating quite a bit of resentment.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I guess I hadn't thought of it that way because, my inclination when I first look at it is to be like, it's entirely unjust, but you made a really good point. And I think also the burden that women bear more than anything is the burden of being beautiful, right? And virginity and sexuality is a beautiful thing. And so women, I think there's more of the weight of beauty there, the beauty of our sexuality. But I think also just historically, more emphasis has just been placed on the virginity of women. Like there are cultures that will kill women who lose their virginity before marriage, or they could be subject to being ostracized or different things. And so it was even historically just seen as more valuable. And I think we're still in that somewhat. But I think also even in some of our language in the church, we've almost given men this pass of like boys will be boys and men are more carnal, more physical, more visual. Like that comes in with the porn narrative, like men are addicted to porn and women just need emotional purity, and I think sometimes men get this pass when they lose their virginity of like, oh, boys will be boys, like that's just how men are, it's unfortunate, right? And that doesn't do men any good, and it doesn't do women any good either. And I think instead it should be obviously like emphasis on the gift of both, and that we're both very sexual beings. Like women are very sexual, but it just expresses itself so uniquely and differently than men, that I think that should be focused on rather than the carnal, like men will be men and they get the free pass, they get out the what is it in Monopoly, the get out of jail free card,
Yeah.
But instead, if we focus on the gift of both, both are valued for what they are.
Yeah, and this isn't a result of abstinence education in the 1990s. I mean, this goes back thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. And part of it, I mean, we've talked about on episodes on modesty, is that the woman is typically blamed for the problem of lust. You're the seductress, you're the occasion of sin, you dress that way, it's kind of on you. But strictly speaking, you can't cause somebody to sin. I mean, you can lead them to sin, you can tempt them to sin, but if you can cause a person to sin, then you strip them of their moral agency. And so I could really irritate you, but I couldn't make you cuss me out. I mean, I could really push you towards that, but at some point you have to choose. And so if we put so much blame upon the woman, the man isn't even a free agent anymore. It's just like, well, I'm the victim of your body.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that again, like it doesn't do any good of building men up to be men, right? And it doesn't encourage their dignity either. And so that one makes me as a woman both frustrated and sad, result.
One of the analogies I've used before in talking on the subject of modesty is that you think about what the cause of robbery is. Like the cause of robbery is not the presence of jewelry in the window of the store. It's the cause of robbery is the presence of greed in the heart of the robber. In the same respect with lust, the cause of lust isn't the human body, isn't the female body. The cause of lust is the heart of the one who is lusting. That's where the redemption needs to take place. Now, this is not to say, oh, then it doesn't matter how you dress. You can just dress whatever way you want. I'm not my brother's keeper. There needs to be a mutual responsibility of souls here that actually care about his well-being. So opt for modesty as a gateway, as a pathway toward love, for him to recognize my body's not the best thing I have to offer, but these things have to be balanced, because I think when too much blame is put on the woman, we go to it's the pendulum effect again. It's like, well, forget that. I can dress however I want. It's like, hey, if we're going to build a civilization of love, we've got to meet somewhere in the middle. We're not pointing fingers at each other. We're looking at ourselves and how we can actually authentically love. Because like you said, so much of there's just outdated cultural norms of just like, look, boys are going to be boys. They're the ones who struggle with lust and temptation and porn. Girls have emotional and modesty issues. And we put people in these little gender stereotyped boxes. People just feel like, well, what's wrong with me? I'm in the wrong box. I'm a guy and I have feelings. I'm a girl and I'm struggling with porn. Like, I'm a freak of nature. It's like, okay. And this is a bit of just the evolution of teaching these things. It's like, we've got to realize that some of our methodologies, sometimes can cause more harm than good.
Yeah, and adapting based on that. And I think, like you said, again, it's bringing the pendulum to the middle, because I've seen a lot of things where even like the books or the articles kind of bashing purity culture and wanting to throw it completely out the window for sexual liberation, right? And that makes me sad, because it's not about throwing away purity culture. Purity culture had some truth to it, just their delivery was not necessarily the best. And so it's about changing the delivery, not changing the content, right? And bringing it to the middle.
Yeah, and this, one thing I've noticed, this isn't just like an American thing. Like a lot of people say, well, this is a result of, George Bush spending this money on abstinence education and, Trump and all the evangelical Christians. Like, this is a global phenomenon that's plagued man for mankind. I mean, from the garden, Adam is like, it's the woman you put here with me. She's the one who, I mean, so this has been a big problem. I remember I'd shared this story once before the podcast, and I was in Haiti once. I was going up this mountain on this little motorcycle with a guy up to this castle on the top of the mountain. You go for a motorcycle part of the way, then you go on like some donkey the rest of the way. And we're riding up there, and this guy was a Haitian native guy, but the culture there is really like, hey, boys are going to be boys, husbands are going to cheat. You just got to be okay with it, girl, okay? So we're riding up the mountain, and he says to me, he's like, Jason, in America, is it like in Haiti? I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, in Haiti, I have a wife, I have children, and then I have a lady friend who I make love to. Is that like America? I'm like, yes, we have that. I said, that's called adultery. And he's like, oh, adultery. I'm like, yes, can you say that? Adultery. And he said, yes, we have that. And I said, look, I have an idea. I said, if you have a lady friend, why don't we find your wife a man friend? Because everybody needs friends, right? And he's like, no, that's not such a good idea. And I'm like, why? Everybody needs friends. But he said, no, I am a man and men will be men. And I make love to her, but I love and I said, you're not making love to her, you're killing love. And, but you need to extend almost a sense of pity for this guy who's, I'm sure, and when he grew up, that's what his brothers are doing, his cousins, his uncles, his fathers. Like, it's just this really messed up culture. But like you said, the solution isn't to throw the baby out with the bathwater of just like, and there has been an over accentuation of sexual differences, but the solution is not to deny them altogether. Because I think what we're seeing here is the reaction you get sometimes to purity culture shows a lot of residue from, I think, a false feminism. And what I mean by that is this idea that, like, no, we have to be even Steven. Like, you can't say that boys are more visual. You can't say boys are more tempted. That's impossible. We have to be. But it's like, okay, this is biology. I mean, an adolescent boy has 20 times as much testosterone in his body as a teenage girl does at the same age. Our brains are different. Our eyeballs, everything head to toe. There's more than 1,559 sex-specific genes throughout our body. And to say, no, we can't have differences, even Steven. That's not even human. And it's seeing our sexual differences as competition instead of complementarity.
Exactly. And I think also working with women who struggle with pornography, I've seen in my own life, why women seek those things out is vastly different than why men seek out porn and masturbation, right? Women do seek it out typically because of a desire for love and for relationship and affirmation and some of those things that men are looking for, but it comes from a very different space and they seek out different resources. There's a lot of like psychological differences that go on for women. And I totally agree. It's not about we're the same. It's we're different. We're complementary sometimes. Like we try. But I think I was thinking at one point that actually like I think it's an interesting sensation that like a lot of the books and articles coming out that are so angry at purity culture are from women. I actually haven't seen one from a man. And I find that interesting as we're talking about this is I think women feel like this injustice and kind of that false feminism. And because a lot of this content is coming from angry, hurt women.
Yeah, no, I mean, every book I've seen, and I've read some of them, are by women. I mean, the only exception to the rule, I think, would be, Joshua Harris wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and then he kind of renounced it in a sense, but he didn't but he's more apologizing for it than anything. He's not so much saying, oh, this really hurt me. He's like, oh, I realized that I hurt some people, and he ended up throwing out a lot of the stuff and unfortunately got a divorce. And a lot of people saw, hey, see that? Purity culture doesn't work. And they kind of saw whatever, difficulties happened in that marriage as evidence that the whole thing was a sham. But yeah, I think because so many women are affected differently by this message, they're the ones now vocalizing this. But I love the point that you made that, if we're just wiping the field of like, hey, everything's got to be even, we're doing no service to women who need to realize they are tempted differently. If you say, oh, boys are tempted more, no, it's better to say boys are tempted differently.
Yes.
And if we say it's more visual or this, we don't need to get all offended and say, oh, well, then therefore you saying like girls aren't visually tempted. It's like, no. Yeah. We've just got to be able to balance it out.
Mm-hmm. And statistically, things tend to go one way or another, all based on your gender. And I mean, I've even seen women so hurt over purity culture that they leave the faith entirely, kind of like a Joshua Harris, where you see this abandonment of personal faith because they're so hurt about the sexual messages or the messages about our sexuality coming from people of faith that they feel so ashamed of themselves that they just leave. And I think that was another huge motivation in writing this, is I want to prevent women, especially, from feeling the weight of that shame, feeling the weight of guilt, so we can repent always. But I want to prevent them from leaving the faith over a misconception of what the truth actually is.
Yeah. And I would hope individuals like Joshua Harris, I mean, I've never met the man, would realize that although he probably got a lot of criticism for what he was doing, he also probably did a lot of good too. I mean, he probably really helped a lot of people avoid stuff. The challenge with measuring the efficacy of abstinence is that you're measuring the presence of absence. Like, okay, if I prevented a broken heart, how do you show that on a bar graph? You know, if I help someone to not contract chlamydia that could have taken away their fertility, and then they could never have had those 3 kids that they had later on. Whoops, looks like we lost her stream. Oh, you're back. Okay, sorry, you cut out there for a second.
Oh, whoops.
But yeah, I mean, it's sometimes hard to measure the absence of something. So I just hope people that, you know, may have been hurt by the culture realize that, hey, there's a lot of good things that still took place. We just need to keep navigating this thing in a better way in order to make it more truly fruitful. But 5th point, I would think, of a real serious harm that comes from idolizing virginity is it kind of exacerbates feelings of betrayal when you discover your prospective spouse isn't a virgin. And then you start to question, well, wait a minute, I've waited all this time. Maybe she's just not the one, because I've always expected I'd have some spotless virgin on my wedding night, but she's not. And I try to point out to these, especially guys struggling with it, because I think guys struggle with this perhaps more than girls. I can't speak. But I try to tell them, like, you don't save your virginity for getting it. It's not like a white elephant gift exchange. You know, like, well, I brought mine to the party. You know, where's yours? This is a sham. You know, but you know, they express me a feeling of being gypped in a sense, and you have to enter into that. Like, okay, look, I understand that. You know, I understand of, like, you've made many, many sacrifices along the road, and you could have done that. You chose not to out of love of your future spouse. And now you're wondering, well, what the heck? You know, when I was waiting for you, why weren't you waiting for me? And so you have to validate those feelings, but at the same time, explain to them, like, she didn't cheat on you. She didn't even know you. She hadn't met you yet. You know, she's in a different place today. And so what a shame it would be to miss out on a beautiful prospective spouse because you're just simply in the pursuit of virginity instead. And if you can't let go of that, then it might be better for you not to marry her, because she doesn't need that hanging over her head for the rest of her natural life. If you're going to lose out on the gift of the person because you're on a quest for simply virginity, maybe the issue of the brokenness isn't so much in hers life, it's in yours.
Yeah. And I think, that's where we have to turn to, like, what is the sexual experience within marriage for? Yeah. Is it for giving away your virginity, or is it for a gift of self, a gift of an entire person? And if you want to collapse it into just virginity, right? Like, I love that you say, like, you don't give your virginity to get it, right, from somebody else. And but is intercourse within marriage about experiencing a whole nother person and giving your whole self, including all your experiences and the consequences of those experiences, or is it about just getting virginity? And I think there is a feeling that we're tempted to feel when we encounter sexual sin in our partner, is like, that, oh, how could you kind of thing. And I think that's also interesting when we just recognize, like, we bring sin into this marriage too, like, everybody is bringing something to the table. And I think that happens when we idolize virginity and chastity as, like, the pinnacle virtue of relationships and of marriage, is we don't give weight to other sin. Like, and I've talked about this a few times, but just that, I haven't received much dating or marriage advice. I'd say more dating than marriage. I haven't received much dating advice, other than just chastity, right? Like, I think in our focus on chastity, which is beautiful and good, we don't always talk about, other aspects of relationships, like how to be selfless, or how to have healthy conflict, or different things like that. How to make financial decisions together, how to pray together. Like, we don't always focus on other virtues and vices, and we make not having sex when you're dating the barometer of a healthy dating relationship, and then we make having sex when you're married the barometer of a healthy marriage. And I think that's also just a result of just maybe too much emphasis on sexuality, whereas it has its place, it's good, it's sacred, it's beautiful, but it isn't the whole of a marriage, or the lack of it isn't the whole of a dating relationship.
No, I like that point, because when it comes to marriage preparation, at least here in the States, I just did a Zoom call with some archdiocese in Sydney, Australia. They're starting marriage preparation courses starting, I think it's like in 7th grade. And I'm like, man, spot on. Like, that's what the church teaches. It's got to be not just like immediate marriage prep, like, oh, we got the ring, we got 6 months, let's figure out what the heck marriage is about. It's like, no, this needs to start. Like, I mean, Pope Francis said marriage preparation begins at birth. That's what the Pope said. And so we're so far behind the game when we start being like, okay, got to get ready for marriage, chastity. You're 16 years old, get this piece figured out. It's like, yeah, well, we don't know how to resolve conflict. We don't agree on Monday. Like, there's nothing that we've really been taught other than don't have sex. And so, that's a great discussion, because like, well, we got to create apostolates in the church of authentic marriage prep long before your pre-Cana weekend, which is kind of last ditch effort to evangelize these people, most of whom have been in the church since their first communion. So
yeah, I'm going on my pre-Cana weekend tomorrow. So it's quite funny. It's like, yes, but no, I completely agree. And I think that almost teaches young men and young women to see each other as sexual beings, like early on, more so than we already do. Is like, if all we can talk about in regards to the opposite sex is chastity, then like, we're not gonna be able to be friends with each other, teach young people how to have holy friendships, that's really good marriage prep, how to be friends.
Yeah, there's a concept.
Yeah.
I think that point ties really well into number 6 here, which is the problem of idolizing virginity creates the problem of reverse objectification. And this is a big one, because if the culture is like glorifying your sexual value, it's almost like, okay, well, we're going to take you one up and we're going to focus on it even more. And it's like, okay, well, wait a minute. What about other gifts? What about other virtues? What about other vices? What about other stuff? It's almost like, hey, if the woman and sexuality is being so focused on, we need to jump on there, focus on it even more. And then it becomes almost an imbalanced approach. And, and so we need to avoid using, as you had alluded to, our sexuality is a barometer for our spirituality, meaning like, I'm addicted to masturbation. God hates me. I'm so far away from God. It's like, oh, well, guess what? Like, you are so generous with poor people. You are a tremendous liver. You're such a, tremendous forgiver. You are just an incredibly generous human being. Like, you have a deep prayer life. There's so much more. But when we just measure our spiritual growth simply by our sexuality and our struggles there, it's not really accurate. And then on the opposite side of that is we have to avoid compartmentalizing, which is the opposite side of the pendulum of, well, hey, Jesus and my spirituality over here, and what I do in the bedroom is over here. So God loves me, so it doesn't matter what I'm doing with my boyfriend, because Jesus loves me. And so we've got to, avoid both of those extremes of like, my sexuality is my spirituality, and the other of compartmentalizing them and saying one does not have to do with the other. I can act like this. God still loves me.
Yeah, the goal is integration, right? Like the goal is always integration of spirituality, sexuality, like our mentality, everything. And that's why I love the Catechism's definition of chastity. It's living out your sexuality according to your state in life, right? And so it's about an integration of where God has you and living out your sexuality in accordance with that. I think the fact that we jump on the conversation even more, kind of like I said, we don't end up talking about other virtues and vices. And I've encountered this a lot just in different women talking to me about like, my boyfriend and I fell, do we need to break up? Like that's the first question is, do we need to break up because we fell in some way, shape or form? And my answer is always like, no. How did he react to your sin, and how did you react? Because if you got back up again and you're like, wow, we shouldn't have done that. We're going to repent. We're going to go to confession. We're going to set boundaries so we don't do it again. Great. That's a man of virtue. You should probably stick with him. But if it's like he makes excuses or you make excuses, that's not necessarily a relationship that's calling you to virtue in general. Like the point is not what kind of sins I think you fall into, but rather how do you respond to the sin that you fall into? Because some couples may struggle more with isolation or pride than they do with sexual sin, right? And so it's all about how do we respond to the vices that we're trying to overcome as a couple, rather than what sort of vices are we struggling with? Because that's not necessarily an indicator of something off.
Yeah, and I would imagine that this, of the 7 points, is one of the ones that really gets under the skin of a lot of women more than anything. It's just like, you told us that this was such a problem, and then you ended up making it feel like this is me, that my worth is based on this, my spirituality is based on this. As long as I just get that part of my life in order, everything else is good. And then maybe they put a lot of effort into it, and then the slip up happens, whatever happens. Then it's just feel like I am completely unloved by God. I am a total failure. And so, yeah, I remember Father Jacques Philippe saying, one of the most important things the devil wants to do is just get you discouraged. If he can just discourage you after a sin, he's pretty much won, because there should be peace. We should even retain our peace after a fall, because if we're overly discouraged, it's sometimes a side of pride, of just like, I'm so astonished I fell. Like, you didn't know you're human. But I think if we overemphasize virginity so much, to the detriment of all the other virtues and vices out there, that if a fall does take place, it becomes the be-all, end-all of my spirituality.
Yeah, and I've found this a lot with women who struggle with sexual sin, right? Because we unfortunately have defined it as more of a male issue. Women who are struggling feel like, am I even a woman? Like, I don't even struggle with a woman's sins. Like, I don't even struggle with a woman's vices, or like the typical vices. Like, am I even like feminine at all? And there's this conflict, this like crisis in your identity as a woman because you struggle. And I think that is a result of perhaps idolizing these things and not keeping them in the middle.
Yeah. Now, bringing this full circle, the seventh and final big problem I see with this whole idolization of virginity is within marriage. And what I mean by that is sometimes if we put it on such a pedestal that it can actually lead, from couples that I've talked to, actual feelings of anxiety or a frigidity in marriage, because the focus of the gift becomes like that one-time experience on the wedding night, rather than like the exchange of the gift of persons. And so the wedding night becomes like the moment of truth that has to be kind of like mythically perfect. And if I'm not a virgin, then it can't be what it was supposed to be. And if I am a virgin, well, like, this is the night of my life. And some might even, if they've so focused on virginity equals innocence, that if they're actually losing their virginity on their wedding night, is there a loss of innocence? And so that can kind of create some confusion. I've read of some bloggers who are, experiencing that. I remember reading one guy who was a musician, and this is a quote he said, life in Lubbock, Texas taught me two things. One is that God loves you and you're going to burn in hell. The other is that sex is the most awful, filthy thing on earth, and so you should save it for someone you love. And so I had to laugh at that. But I mean, imagine how many kids didn't maybe get the best chastity education and thought, okay, sex is dirty, sex is bad, sex is, it makes you tainted. Okay, you're married, have at it. Okay, now I get to give this thing that's dirty to the person I love more than anybody. So maybe speak to, how the idolization of virginity can create issues as we're entering into marriage.
Yeah, I love that. I also think, I think there's an attitude of, if I save my virginity for marriage, the reward for that will be, a blissful, perfect wedding night or blissful, perfect married sex for the rest of my life, right? And we don't have those realistic expectations about what sex with another human being is. And as somebody who's engaged, I've encountered the ease of like thinking that, where you're like, oh yeah, I've been good, so therefore, and that's just not realistic. Like, you should look forward to married life with this person, which includes sex, which is something you should learn and something that is beautiful, but it's learned. It's not this reward for preserving virginity, and it's not going to be Hollywood because you preserved your virginity. But I think I've heard of, I've known some friends who have experienced that fear and that frigidity in marriage, but I've also heard from some medical professionals that this is something they encounter a lot, is that women have to end up coming to seek medical help or like psychological help to give their virginity to their spouse. And I think the term there is really important, is that they haven't been told they're giving something, they've been told they're losing something, right? So if we're told, like, don't lose your virginity, right? Hold on to it, hold on tight, white knuckle it, like, don't lose it. We can't psychologically change that narrative, like, just because we have two rings on our finger. I think if we place the emphasis on this, this is a gift, and give it freely and give it well in your marriage. Like, I think that's where we have to change. It's just our terminology is focus on this of, this is a gift because you are, and you can give it freely in this context. It's not you're losing a part of you, or you're losing your identity, or you're losing your innocence. I've even seen this portrayed in like a TV show, where the main character was like so focused on being a virgin and like that was like her thing, you know, and then when she gives it away, she's like upset and she's kind of traumatized. And I think I was kind of appreciative of that show portraying that reality. Obviously the answer that the show poses is to be sexually liberated prior to marriage, which I don't think is the answer, but I thought they made a good point of we can't hinge our identity on this, especially as women.
Yeah, no, I think you're giving the right answer because, like, as the world said, you know, like, well, you don't want to end in marriage and be sexually inexperienced and not know what to do. So you got to get out and experience the stuff so you won't be so frigid. But I mean, and they say, look, a lot of people are getting married and then, you know, having sex in marriage finally, and then they're disappointed and they end up getting divorced because they're not experienced. But look, the numbers don't bear that out. I mean, people who get married as virgins actually have a divorce rate that's about 70% lower than people who choose not to wait until marriage. Now, it doesn't mean you're doomed to have a horrible marriage if you've lost your virginity, but the statistics are strongly on the side of the church on this topic. You can look it up. It's extremely clear, but we've just got to be careful, like you said, not to preach some sexual prosperity gospel. That like, if you just save this, man, it is going to be an endlessly ecstatic, blissful sexual experience throughout your marriage. But like, it doesn't work like that, you know, and we can't make those false promises. You know, sometimes we'll even have issues where, you know, the guy gets married, the girl, but he's been looking at porn and all kinds of stuff. And he's thinking, well, hey, but I was a virgin, but you're not a virgin. It's like, well, wait a minute, you're bringing into our marriage all these memories you have of other guys. And she might be like, what about those like 10,000 women you've been looking at on your internet? Like, well, it's two-dimensional women. That doesn't count. They're not three-dimensional. It's like, and so there's other issues that could be really at play here. And so also if we're expecting like the wedding night to be like the moment of truth, study after study show like the most satisfying sexual times in marriage is not within the first year or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10. It's typically decades into marriage where you really learn to love each other. And so you don't want to overemphasize the first night of like everything's got to get figured out, all the technique. I mean, you're going to have a lifetime to figure it out. And look, if you don't get it right the first time, all right, try again later. You know, I mean, is that the worst that could happen? Like, and so, but like you said, sometimes people do need to receive counseling for this stuff. Sometimes there's issues going on for any number of legitimate reasons. And so couples should not be afraid to seek out Catholic sex therapists that can be able to talk with them through these things. If you just go to CatholicTherapists.com, you can look for a therapist in your area, see one who's trained in this topic, and they can help you. Because some are going to give bad advice, obviously, that aren't rooted in Catholic theology and morality. But if you can find a good one, there's no need to bottle this stuff up. I mean, this stuff needs to come to the surface so you can have the intimacy, I think, that you deserve.
Yeah, you know? I completely agree. Absolutely. And
so, I can wrap it up. Yeah. And so with all the, you know, the stuff that we brought up, I mean, purity culture, I think there's legitimate things in it that need to be denounced. But I think a lot of times people are denouncing and writing it off, not simply because of those issues, but because there's a bigger problem of resentment toward chastity. This was something that John Paul talked about in his book, Love and Responsibility. And I'm just going to do a quote here where he talks about resentment. And he said, resentment not only distorts the features of the good, but devalues that which rightly deserves respect, so that the man need not struggle to raise himself to the level of the true good, but can lightheartedly recognize as good what only suits him, what is convenient and comfortable to him. And so this is the problem of resentment, of people saying, oh, purity, culture, chastity, throw it away. When in reality, it's like, that's too demanding. There's a good there, but then rather than admit that I'm refusing to accept the challenge of the good, I'm going to treat the good like it is unhealthy, unnatural, and repressive. So I will tear down the good instead of admitting I just don't want to live up to it. And to me, that's also what's behind. Yeah, there's some legitimate issues with purity culture, but to be honest, there's also a rejection of the cross.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like this is where the gift of self and John Paul II's theology of the body is just so amazing and so truly liberating for us. Is it's never we were oppressing people. It's we weren't saying enough, right? Like we weren't saying things enough. And I think that's what this conversation comes down to, is like we weren't telling women they're loved and redeemed enough. Like we weren't telling people what a gift virginity is enough. And it's never we've pushed it down, like we're doing it wrong, or it's we haven't said the truth enough, and we haven't said the truth in love enough, and so it's actually an increase. Like turn the dial up, maybe say it differently, but turn the dial up rather than get rid of it all.
And I think it's the perfect note to end on, is that like you still have the gift of yourself to give.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what's happened to you, what you've done, what's happened. I mean, you still have yourself to give. And like I often encourage people, like they might thinking, if maybe one's a virgin, one's not, and they're getting closer to marriage, of thinking, well, wait a minute, she's experienced this before, he has, and I haven't. I try to reassure them, actually, this is the first time either one of you is going to be experiencing making love as a sacrament. Neither one of you. Maybe one of you has had sex before, but neither one of you has made love as a sacrament. That's why it was the artist Salvador Dali said the only way to make love is as a sacrament. And so if you can start to look forward to realize, okay, this in many ways is going to be a first for us. Something that's holy, something where God is present, where there's no shame, where there's no fear of getting caught or impregnated or infected or any of that stuff, but truly free. And so no matter what's happened, everybody still has their self to give. But before I let you go, I do want to give you an opportunity. I want to hear about Magdala Ministries and the stuff that you guys are starting to do over there, so listeners can know how to connect with you, read the blog on Idolizing Virginity, and dive deeper into these topics. Because we just connected for the first time like 2 weeks ago. Kelsey Stoke, who wrote the book Uncompromising Purity, said, hey, I think you guys should connect. And I read your blog and I'm like, oh, I got to get this girl on the podcast. And so tell the listeners about what it is that you guys are doing over there.
Yeah, so Magdala is a result of many years of my frustration of there being no Catholic resources just for women when it comes to struggling with pornography, and masturbation. And I've been speaking about the topic and writing about the topic for about 5 years now. And so this just kind of just got off the ground. It's like a fresh baby ministry website. So basically, like, it's for women to find community and accountability in their struggle against sexual addiction. So on our website, they can fill out a form in 30 seconds, and it's a confidential form. As of right now, I'm the only member of our team who sees it. And we organize them into virtual small groups through the Marco Polo app. And so they can talk to each other, find accountability. And we've started a few small groups already. And then we also have the blog where you found Idolizing Virginity, which was actually a repost from a site called The Young Catholic Woman, which I highly recommend for all young Catholic women. And it's just a great resource. And I've been writing for them for a couple of years. So I'm super grateful to their editing team for helping me with this article and getting it out there and being the first to publish it. But then we're also starting a podcast on Magdala too, just so women can have content made just for them to help them overcome this and heal. And so they can have a place of honesty and hope when it comes to sexual addiction.
And we'll put the link to the website in the show notes. But for those who are just listening right now or driving in the car, what's the website where they can connect with you?
That's probably important. Yeah, it's magdalaministries.org. So Magdala is like Mary of Magdala, and it's Magdala ministries.org. So there you'll find how to join the group, podcast, blog, everything.
Well, Rachel, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the show. For those listeners watching, if you want to support the podcast and help us to grow this, support the family as well, just go to patreon.com/Jason Evert. You get all kinds of free swag, t-shirts, books, give you our personal email. If you got questions, you can send them in. We'll answer them on the podcast for you. But it's just a tremendously helpful way to support our family, our ministry, and this podcast, to keep bringing on awesome guests like Rachel, to bring this life-saving message to girls and guys. That doesn't matter what happened in the past. It might be a messy past, but hey, your future is spotless. So Rachel, God bless you. Keep up the wonderful work, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.